Hello and welcome to this first Multilateral Thinking webcast. My name is Rebecca Harding. I'm the Chief Executive of Coriolis Technologies, and it's my very great pleasure to share with you some of the thoughts that we've been having during lockdown. First question to ask is, what does trade look like now, and what's it going to look like in the coming years? The first thing to say there is that trade has obviously suffered during the course of the last few months. We're beginning to see that trade is beginning to creep up to somewhere near its normal levels. But if you look at a country like China, for example, it's still only at 80% of its pre-COVID levels. Now, if you take that to a bigger forecast picture, where are we seeing the biggest impact? Well, we're seeing the biggest impact in the oil producing and oil exporting nations. So particularly the Middle East and North Africa, Africa and Latin America are going to be very severely affected by the downturn, not least because oil prices have been hit so badly and stayed low for so long. Second thing to say is that Asia and Europe and North America are actually going to pull out as demand starts to pick up. However, one of the things that worries us, of course, is the extent to which we're going into a second phase of COVID and the extent to which that will affect trade in the future. In any event, what we're predicting for the G20 countries in the world is that most of those countries won't see trade values return to their pre-COVID levels for at least 2 or 3 years. There are some countries that are worse affected than others, and we're seeing some obvious advantages for China out of this, and Vietnam is one of the big winners. So what questions are going to influence trade? What things are going to influence trade the most in the coming years? There's still a lot of uncertainty out there. So Brexit and its relationship with the European Union, the UK's relationship with the European Union, is going to have a big impact, particularly on the United Kingdom. One of the things that we've noticed in the data is that intra-regional trade has been growing very rapidly. Now, some of that is obviously in the news at the moment. We're seeing a big increase, not least because countries are saying we want to be less dependent on one supplier. And by this, they often mean China. But if you look back at the data over the last few years, intra-regional trade has been growing anyway. So we're now in a situation where the European Union, for example, the EU 27 minus the United Kingdom, has seen its intra-regional trade grow by nearly 8% over the last 3 years. And it's grown particularly rapidly between 2016 and 2018, the years after the referendum. Can the UK survive alone when it's all by itself against these big regional blocs that are beginning to develop? It's a difficult question to answer because obviously the United Kingdom is looking elsewhere for trading partners. But in a world where trade is becoming more politicised or weaponised, it's difficult for one country that only accounts for 2.5% of world trade to carry on just by itself. And let's have a look at that other thing then, the weaponisation of trade, the politicisation of trade. Let's look at a country like China. Is China going to be able to survive COVID? Is COVID going to have more of an impact, or will it be the trade wars between the United States and China? We've done some modelling on this, and it looks like the trade wars are actually going to have very little effect on China overall in the coming months and into next year. A lot of that is because China is strong, but it's also because the trade wars themselves are affecting digital trade now more than they're affecting goods trade. But the other thing to say is China, like every other country in the world, is dependent on whether or not demand picks up globally. So we're actually saying that COVID will have a bigger short-term impact on China than the effects of the trade wars. So where does all of this leave trade? Trade in the coming years is going to be driven by 4 mega themes, if you like. The first, and we're seeing this very clearly in evidence that we're getting from clients and from the SME community itself, is that small and medium-sized enterprises are going to be finding it increasingly difficult to access trade finance. We're going to be watching that one closely. The second thing to say is that technology is increasingly driving the way in which trade is done, and we've seen that accelerate as well during the COVID-19 pandemic. What banks are trying to do is save money, save time, save resources in an environment where trade finance is difficult because monetary policy, interest rates are extremely low, and it's more difficult for those banks to make profit out of smaller sized deals. The third thing that is a mega theme is the way in which banks themselves are starting to say that they need to track environmental and sustainable development goals. There's been a big push in the United Kingdom, but all the way around the world, to start to look at environmental supply chains and start to monitor where goods are coming into and going out of countries in a way that may not be sustainable. The trade sector as a whole stands to lose 30% of its profitability by becoming more sustainable, but the other big question is, can it afford not to be sustainable as environmental pressures ramp up? The final thing to say, and this perhaps is the most important of all, is that as we pull out of the COVID crisis, the world of trade will never be the same again. There's going to be more digitisation of trade, more digitisation of trade finance. There's going to be more pressure on the environment. Supply chains are going to regionalise or localise. And small and medium-sized companies, when they're trading across borders, are increasingly going to use non-banks rather than banks. Against this backdrop, we're also seeing a tension between the United States and China that we cannot expect to change after the election in November. Why? Because Joe Biden is taking a very similar approach to the approach taken by Donald Trump, and we're expecting that harshness of tone to carry on into next year and beyond, no matter who wins. So one thing we can say for absolute certain is that COVID has accelerated some of the pressures that we were seeing anyway, rapid technological change and a focus on environmentally sustainable supply chains, as well as the pressures for SMEs. But more than anything else, the world of trade is being changed fundamentally by the US-China trade conflict, which is increasingly a strategic conflict between the two nations. As we pull out, the world of trade will never be the same again. Thank you very much for listening.